First descendant was Hugh Roberts, and this was not a difficult lineage to really discover because family members through the years had discovered the lineage back to Hugh Roberts, the first descendant, and kind of that line up to W. Milner Roberts. My job and what I anticipated doing was trying to verify that information to make sure it was correct by using primary sources. And the other part was to try to find out a little bit about the descendants. We wanted to have more than just names and dates. We wanted to know a little bit about the individual. Hugh Roberts was an incredible man. He was an early Welsh Quaker. His family had a large farm in Wales. His father was Sir Hugh Roberts, and Sir Hugh Roberts actually lived to be 102 years old. He outlived his son. Hugh was very educated. However, he was being persecuted in Wales, as were others, for being in the Society of Friends and not participating in the state church at that time. And so he accepted William Penn's invitation to come to America. He sailed to America with his wife and 5 of his children and his mother. His mother actually passed away in Philadelphia eventually. His father came at a later date and stayed in America for some time, but actually returned to Wales, and that's where Sir Hugh Roberts passed away. Hugh would become a minister in the Society of Friends and actually returned to Wales at least 2 times to bring back other Quakers who were being persecuted to the New World. So if you look at the records of Hugh Roberts, you'll see that the ships that he sailed on in the passenger list for those, if you do research on Ancestry.com, you can see his trips to Wales. He became one of the most prominent landowners of the time around Philadelphia. In 1702, he owned a 1,400-acre plantation called Chestnut Hill. A writer of the time described Hugh Roberts in this way. He was a man of much enthusiasm, and his letters and journals abound with the evidence of it. He was a man of warm, affectionate disposition, full of love for his friends and family, and not fearing to express it. I think that kind of personality came down through the family, as we'll see. As we look at the direct lineage of Hugh Roberts, we'll see that one of the interesting things that I enjoyed looking at in this lineage is how the names of this family evolved. And maybe you'll find out today, or maybe you already know, where your name came from in this Roberts family. The first son, the eldest son of Hugh Roberts, Robert Roberts, who does that, right, to a child, he followed in his father's footsteps. He also became a minister in the Society of Friends. His wife passed away, however, his first wife and his first child, when he was living in Philadelphia. And so at that point, Robert Roberts moved to Baltimore County and there became a minister in the Society of Friends. He had a large plantation there, and he went on to have 10 children. His oldest son, Isaac, was described as being a stout, athletic man, later in life very large in bulk. He owned a brickyard in Philadelphia. He actually moved from Baltimore County as an adult back to the family home area of Philadelphia. There he had 10 children, and as you see, he married Hannah Pascal. And some of the names that come down through the family are women's maiden names that are passed on. And this is one that we'll see as we go along in the family lineage. The son of Isaac was Abraham, and Abraham died really at a fairly young age. In 1797, yellow fever devastated the area of Philadelphia, and Abraham passed away from obtaining that yellow fever. He had 3 children with Rachel Milner. And Rachel Milner, you see that Milner name, that maiden name that has come down through the family. Her father was William Milner, and her brother was William Milner Jr., who was a representative in Congress in the early 1800s, and later he was a mayor of Philadelphia. There are quite a few mayors of Philadelphia in this family, not only in the direct line, but also in the line of those that the family married into. The next in the line is Thomas, who was a very prominent businessman. He was treasurer of the Union Canal Company. He married the daughter of Hilary Baker, who was a mayor of Philadelphia. They had 9 children. And as we'll see going through the family, there were quite a few instances where brothers and sisters married brothers and sisters. And this is the case with Thomas. His sister Margaret married Hilary Jr. If we go off that direct line just a little bit, Mary Baker's sister Elizabeth married a man by the name of John Van Loo. And they had a daughter also named Elizabeth. The women's names were passed down to their daughters quite often. Elizabeth Van Loo was a spy during the Civil War. And in the room, I think on this back table, there's a book about Elizabeth Van Loo. And it's interesting that that name Van Loo, that the Roberts were married into, was actually a name that was passed down. We'll see that in the lineage as we go along. W. Milner Roberts I will talk about him a little bit more as we go along, but I want to mention his wife, Annie Gibson, who was the daughter of John Bannister Gibson, a Supreme Court Justice of Pennsylvania. He was a Shakespearean scholar, and he was a violinist. His violinist was in the family for some time. I don't know what happened to it during the years, but at least at some point, his violin was passed down. His father was Colonel George Gibson, who served with George Washington. Now, W. Milner I named a son John Bannister Gibson Roberts, after the grandfather, and then 2 of W. Milner's sons, W. Milner II, and his brother Richard, both named sons John Bannister Gibson Roberts. So there were 3 of them. It causes some confusion to have all of those same names. I will speak to more about W. Milner II in a few moments. I want to talk about W. Milner's wife, Elizabeth Humbard. The Humbard name was passed down through the family to both men and women in the family. The Humbard family is really another program, and you're going to hear me say this throughout the presentation because the family and their work is so massive. It's more than could be shared today. But Jacob Humbard, the father of Betty Humbard, actually was the son of a poor farmer. He was apprenticed as a blacksmith at a very young age, but as soon as that apprenticeship was finished, he and his brother John took up building canals, and he came to Cumberland to build the C&O Canal. He later was involved in the building of the B&O Railroad from Cumberland to Wheeling. He was a close friend of Dom Pedro II, and that came about due to his partnership with W. Milner Roberts as they were building railroads in Brazil. And kind of a little interesting note, Dom Pedro, the Emperor of Brazil, was here in this country in 1876 attending the centennial, and he had his train stopped in Cumberland so he could visit with Jacob Humbard, his old friend from Brazil. This lineage is full of stories, more stories than I can share today, not only of this direct lineage, but also their brothers and sisters, those massive families, the families that they married into. There were politicians, military officers, artists, educators, businessmen, and so much more in this lineage of the Roberts family. I want to give you just a little sample of some of the stories off of that direct lineage. One is of Hugh Roberts' youngest son, Edward. Now, we talked about Robert Roberts as our direct line, his eldest son, but his youngest son, Edward, must have been a favorite. He was really in charge of the plantation. He was bequeathed Chestnut Hill when Hugh Roberts passed away. And Edward had a son that he named Hugh after his father, of course. And Hugh Roberts, that young Hugh Roberts, actually was very well-to-do, not only from inherited money, but from his own right, his own business practices. And in 1772, that Hugh Roberts was on a list of 74 Philadelphians that owned carriages. And of course, that was a true sign of wealth at that time. Another one of Hugh's sons, Owen, was the great-great-great-grandfather of Isaac Eugene Craig. Isaac Eugene Craig is an eminent American artist and painted portraits. This is an example of one of his works. You can see how good his artwork is. Isaac Eugene Craig is a totally another story. His history, he ended up in Florence, Italy. There are still Craig paintings available. There are family members that hold these paintings. So an interesting connection into the Roberts family. Of all of that lineage, the most impressive, I believe, is that of W. Milner Roberts I. And in the words of his granddaughter, and I hope I'm not killing some pronunciations here, but his granddaughter, Eleanor Christie Roberts Batesel. Bazell? Okay.
Right.
Correct?
That's my father's name.
Okay. In her words, in a letter to another granddaughter, Eleanor Roberts Bruce, this is what she says about W. Milner I. Personally, I consider that no matter what high positions our Roberts forebears held, the stupendous amount of valuable work done by our grandfather, W. Milner Roberts I, surpassed many of his ancestors, possibly everyone. I have never heard of an engineer who could manage so many extensive projects at the same time. W. Milner I had 8 siblings. I have their names, I have dates about them, but I was really unable to find out too much about his siblings. I know about 2 of them. One, his sister, Eliza Van Loo, there's that name that was passed down. He was very close to. She actually helped take care of his children at some point in his life. And then he had a brother named Thomas Sanford Roberts. Thomas Sanford was a deaf mute who married a deaf mute, and they both, that was a result of having scarlet fever as children. He supposedly was an artist, and again, I was unable to put my hands on any of his artwork, but it would be an interesting thing to continue to research. W. Milner Roberts' life was massive. His work was, major works were massive. And I constructed a timeline, which you will have in your handout, of William Milner's career. Again, as I want to just make sure that you understand, this is just the major highlights of his work. So this is a 2-page timeline, you can imagine. Most of his work can be documented through a primary source at Montana State University that has the writings, the correspondence, diaries, photographs of his life. And so much of this information came from them. At age 12, W. Milner Roberts I was a child prodigy. He excelled in mathematics and architecture at Philadelphia's Franklin Institute. By the age of 15, he began his first employment. As an adult, he was 5 foot 7 inches tall, 138 pounds, and had boundless energy. His early work centered in Pennsylvania. He was building railroads, canals, working with river improvements. Some of his work still stands today. Amidst long work days, he married Annie Gibson and began his family. His reputation and work ethic, however, just caused his workload to increase greatly, and his work expanded to Canada, Ohio, and on out into the Midwest. As he did this type of work further west, he still maintained a relationship with the Pennsylvania legislature to continue the improvements of Pennsylvania. If there was anybody in Pennsylvania that would ever or should ever be recognized for transportation that the state has, it would be W. Milner Roberts I. As far as I could find, his work was really not recognized. I think it's something we need to do something about because his handprint is on so much of Pennsylvania's transportation. In 1857, his wife passes away, and shortly after, his 7th child, Charles Blount, passes away as well. And so this was a very, very difficult time for W. Milner Roberts I. He travels to Brazil as the head of an American contracting company to bid for the construction of the second Dom Pedro Railway. He had turned down the bid for the first one as he was working on other projects, but I think he probably felt a change was good. It was a time when the Civil War was beginning in this country, and so I think it was all maybe part of his thought process. He was the head of that firm of American contractors. He left his children with his sister, Eliza Van Loo, for a while he did that bid process. It was awarded to W. Milner I, and he came back to this country, and in 1859 took his sister and family to Brazil. The construction of this railway in Brazil is some of the finest railway engineering and construction in the world, especially for that time. The railway was used to export coffee from the jungles of Brazil to the ports, the Santa Harbor ports and others, out of the country to increase the wealth of Brazil. The Brazilian experience, those whole years that the family spent there, is an area that could be an entire program. It requires more research to see what all of their work was. W. Milner eventually returns to America and continues to build railroads and work on river improvements for the government of this country. And one of the interesting projects during this time was a project called Eads Bridge, which is the bridge over the Mississippi at St. Louis. The bridge still stands, and it's named for the architect of that bridge, who was James Eads. The interesting thing is, and probably one of the little-known facts about it is, that James Eads became very ill at the start of this project and actually went to Europe. Not sure whether he was recovering from the illness or being treated for the illness or what that was. But guess who built that bridge? W. Milner Roberts I. It really should be called the Roberts Bridge. In 1869, W. Milner Roberts remarried and had 3 additional children. And in 1870, he probably got the dream job of his life offered to him. It was the job to build a transcontinental Northern Pacific Railway. Probably one of the most interesting things I read about W. Milner Roberts involves the building of this railway. There was an expedition called the Yellowstone Surveying Expedition. And the interesting thing about W. Milner Roberts is he was selected not only to build it, but to come up with funds for building it. And that was part of what this expedition was all about. Few historians really know a lot about this expedition. However, it is very well documented in the information at Montana State University. The Yellowstone Valley had just recently been given to the Native Americans in a treaty. It was to be their hunting ground. It was beautiful. It was full of game. And now a transcontinental railroad was going to be built right through it. It was the first study of the valley. The success of this expedition relied on the skill of the incorruptible and hardworking chief engineer, W. Milner Roberts. The success was to give the financing for the railroad. Now, W. Milner Roberts was a prolific writer. He penned notes during the whole survey, correspondence, letters, journals, and a lot of it he wrote while riding on horseback, if you can imagine. He never stopped working. There were a lot of problems with the survey. The Native Americans were unhappy. The military group that was sent to protect the surveyors were not happy. There was a lot of politics and a lot of financial problems with the expedition. And these problems made W. Milner Roberts the perfect candidate for the job. This is how he's described. Not enough money in the U.S. Treasury to buy him away from his conscience or make him surrender a deliberately formed professional opinion. His patience and sweetness were inexhaustible, except when in his business he uncovered a thief or liar. He could not tolerate the alcoholic type common among military and railroad personnel of the era due to its interference with his strong work ethic. Despite his age and slight deafness, Roberts, whose intelligence, fairness, and gentle humor were so rare, enjoyed great popularity among the younger engineers. W. Milner was definitely the who's who of American civil engineers. The survey article is fascinating reading. There are a couple of copies here, I believe on the table back there. I can definitely print it out for anybody who will like it and send it to you. The article describes the countryside, the camp life, food, the work, the surveying team, the Native Americans that were encountered, being shot at by the team that was supposed to be protecting you, and more. In 1873, in the Panic of 1873, W. Milner Roberts lost most of his assets. During this time, he became vice president and president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. In 1876, when his son-in-law was killed, he took on the financial responsibility of his daughter and her 3 children. And all of that, I think, led to his next decision, which was in 1879 to accept a 3-year contract for the waterway improvements in Brazil. He was to be paid $20,000 a year in gold for that project. Unfortunately, in 1881, he died just 6 months short of completing the project and was buried actually in Brazil. However, in 1883, his wife had his remains brought back to Philadelphia, where he's buried today. I want to talk a little bit about the Brazilian experience. So I'm going to backtrack a little bit. There was a book written by Brian Pohanka that's based on the diary of Annie Gibson Yates, the sister of W. Milner Roberts II, the daughter of W. Milner Roberts I. And it talks about their voyage out of Baltimore with W. Milner Roberts, his children, and sister Eliza. At the time, W. Milner Roberts II was 21 years old. John Bannister Gibson Roberts was 18. George was 14. Annie was 10. Richard was 5. And Thomas was 16. Though he didn't sail immediately with the family, he was still attending school here in America, but later sailed to Brazil and had quite an interesting experience, which is another story, dealing with the Civil War and his sailing experience to Brazil. They settled in a town called, I'm not sure the pronunciation, I'm saying Macaco, could be different. It's translated as Monkeyville. It was 45 miles south of Rio de Janeiro at the edge of the jungle. The children had quite an adventure. It was like an adventure park to them. You can imagine at the age of 10 and 16 and 5 what that might have been like. They had a swamp rat and an armadillo as a pet. The armadillo followed them around the house. They had a diet of monkey, snake, and huge red ants, and a very active outdoor life. Annie and Richard could be seen riding horseback, bareback, without any saddles or bridles, standing on the horses. And that venturesome Annie continued through her life to be quite an adventure. And though they were having all of this fun, the W. Milner Roberts made sure that they were educated as well. John, George, and Mill all assisted their father in building railroads in Brazil. Mill spent a lot of time with a Harvard naturalist. He was very interested in plants and in learning as much as he could in that area. Annie was an avid reader. She could read and speak French and Portuguese. Later, she would learn to read and speak 7 languages. Tom, quite musical as well, played the flute with the group, so added a different instrument to the singing and musicians of that era. Dom Pedro was a frequent visitor to the family and actually he liked to recite Longfellow, and he and Annie would spend hours reciting poetry with the family, so they learned a lot. The stories of each of these children, again, I will say, is another program. Their lives are so rich, so dedicated, so giving to society. My focus, of course, will be on W. Milner Roberts II, but I just want to give a little glimpse of the brothers and sisters. First of all,